Hi, everyone, and welcome to MacDowell, New York City. I'm Brett Solomon, the Director of Events and Public Programs. Thank you for joining us in person and via live stream tonight. For those who don't know, MacDowell is America's oldest arts residency program with 450 acres and 31 artist studios in beautiful Peterborough, New Hampshire. And we have our beautiful presentation space here in New York. Artists stay in Peterborough for 2 to 6 weeks and are provided a studio, 3 chef-catered meals a day, and a community of multidisciplinary peers to work with. Visual artists, filmmakers, playwrights, choreographers, composers, architects, journalists, and more. Past fellows include Colson Whitehead, Celine Song, James Baldwin, Leonard Bernstein, Ann Patchett, Gio Tolentino, Carrie Mae Weems, among thousands of others. We also present annual awards and public programs around topics affecting our artist community. This talk is the first of a series of 3 this year, created in partnership with the Henry Luce Foundation. In their mission to deepen knowledge and understanding in pursuit of a more democratic and just world, they take great care, just as we do with our artists, to consider the best ways to nurture individuals, institutions, and communities. Given the climate internationally in 2025, we felt it appropriate to focus our first talk around the discipline of journalism with a particular eye towards alternative newsrooms. How do these spaces get set up for success? What are some of the challenges facing journalists working today? To moderate this talk and introduce you to your panelists, I'd like to introduce the Interim President of the Henry Luce Foundation, Sean Buffington.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, great. Well, it is a thrill to be here. This is the first of what will be 3 collaborations between the Henry Luce Foundation and MacDowell. And so fingers crossed, let's hope all goes well tonight. But thanks so much for being here. We have a terrific, I think, panel for you tonight and a great conversation. I will introduce our panelists. We're gonna have a little bit of a conversation up here. And then after 45, 50 minutes or so, we will open it up for questions with all of you. Yeah, there will be a microphone that you can address your question to. Also, I should say, did you already say that we're live streaming? So, oh, okay, great. All right, terrific. So, and we also greet our, I don't know, maybe 100 or so folks who had signed up to live stream. So, hi, everybody. So, without further ado, let me introduce our 3 panelists. We have Tristan Ahtone, who is an editor-at-large at Grist. This is Tristan. Welcome. We have Lauren Williams, who is CEO and co-founder of Capital B. And Jin Ding, who until just very recently was CEO of Initium Media. And I'll tell you more about what it is that they do, or they'll tell you more about what it is they do. I wanted to start actually by going back in time. So when each of you began in the field of journalism, Tristan, I don't mean to date you, but I'm afraid I have to. Tristan, that was something like 2006, Lauren, something like 2004, and Jin, maybe 2009. So at that time, traditional news media, I think, was changing rapidly. Now, local news hadn't yet been completely decimated, but it was in crisis. The big metropolitan news organizations were struggling, but they were still putting up a valiant fight. So maybe we couldn't see at that point where we would be in 2025, but it was clear, I think then, 15, 20 years ago, that we were in the midst of a great transformation in the field of journalism and news. So I'm curious to know, what motivated you, seeing what you were seeing, what motivated you to enter the field at that fraught time? And what was it like to start in journalism under those conditions of instability? Maybe we'll start with Tristan.
Oh, well, first, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Why did I go into journalism during that time? I suppose one reason would be sunk costs already. I had already gone through the classes and the grad school. You know, it was really hard to back out at that point. I think generally, though, sort of sticking with it and staying in journalism again it really comes from sort of just a belief in journalism. I think it's still something that really guides my work today. I think it's to some degree maybe even a bit foolish on my part to think that there's a power in journalism and there's a power in doing good reporting, but that's what got me into journalism in the first place. It's what got me to stay with it, even through that, especially that terrible time and recession during the late 2008 and into 10. Yeah, I truly believe in sort of the power of journalism. I'm definitely a true believer, for better or worse, in it.
How about you, Lauren?
So I went to grad school at Syracuse to get my master's in journalism after, being sort of unclear about what I wanted my profession to be my entire college career. The funny thing about the degree that I have, it's in magazine, newspaper, and online journalism. Like, they had to specify online journalism, which is really funny. And the thing that made it online and not just magazine and newspaper was, like, they taught us HTML as if that was something that we were actually going to be doing in the practice of journalism. But I think it really sets up that moment of, like, transition for the industry. They were trying to figure out the answer to how to transition into this world of online journalism, and not maybe fully grasping that journalism was just online journalism yet. I got into the business because I'm nosy and I like to write. And I don't think that back then, I mean, it's all I've ever done. So I was straight from college to grad school, straight from grad school to working in a local newspaper. I don't think that I was particularly clear-eyed about this transition, except for that I understood that there was one happening. I don't think I was someone who was analyzing the industry so deeply to understand what the deep challenges were to come. Well, I don't think really anyone really knew, but I do. I think that once I was in it, those challenges became very apparent, and also the importance of fighting through them and sticking with it became apparent as well. And through the practice of it, it was very much not just an outlet for my own curiosities, but I gained a much, much deeper understanding of its importance for democracy.
Jin.
Well, I did not grow up in America, so I started started in journalism in China, 2009. But before that, I'm also a daughter of a journalist family. Both my parents actually were journalism major. My dad is a career journalist, editor-in-chief of a local newspaper as well. So I grew up in newsroom. But that was on top of a news printing factory back in the days. So always curious about it, and also learn a lot about news making, news printing, just watching how my parents work. And I was very, very inspired by, even in China, these days people couldn't probably even understood. At the time, my generation who became journalists, because we have been reading a lot of investigative pieces in China, and that had actually changed the society, changed the way people think about certain government restrictions, legislation, and I believed that I would be able to, become a local journalist in China. I actually still dream to be a local journalist in my own city in China, and to write about people's life and actually change their life through journalism. I didn't really care whether or not which format it was. I was a better writer than I was a TV producer, for example. So I chose that career in a print newsroom. At the time, China didn't even have WeChat yet. So online was really a normal thing. And then I came to the US. Actually, my first job in a nonprofit news environment was through a Luce grant back in the days, working on China.
Where was that? At Pulitzer?
Yes, Pulitzer Center.
Okay, great. So we're gonna fast forward now. We'll turn from the past and talk a little bit about the future. So Grist, capital B, and Initium represent, it seems to me at least, three very different kinds of innovations in the news space, the contemporary news space. So Grist is a topically focused news outlet that aims to fill a gap in coverage in a critical subject area, which is environment and climate change. Capital B covers news of concern to a particular community, in this case the African American community, and has a special emphasis on deep local engagement with community. And then Initium reports on China in Chinese for a global diasporic community. And so these are really one of the reasons, I mean, these are three terrific people, which is why they're here, but also they are engaged in really different kinds of what I think of as sort of directions that contemporary journalism is going in. So I'm curious to know what you think these different approaches maybe tell us about what's missing in traditional media. In other words, what are some of the gaps that you think you're filling that you perceive in traditional media? And then what maybe does it say about where journalism and news media are headed, what the future might look like? And I won't make Tristan go first every time. So maybe we'll start with Laura this time.
Yeah. You know, I think that it's partly what is missing and partly what's been lost is what we were thinking about when we came up with capital B. You know, I think that there's a very storied and amazing legacy of Black newspapers in our country. Local news, period, used to be much more of a present and integral part of our community. Local newspapers used to be this thick, you know, and if they still exist, they're this thick, and they maybe don't come out every day, or maybe they only come out now on Sundays. And, you know, there's real meaning to that loss in our communities. It's not disconnected to the challenges we're seeing across the country, the divisions we're seeing across the country. Local news is vital to the practice and preservation of our democracy. If everyone is getting their news from big national news sources like Fox News or MSNBC, they are losing connection with each other and with their communities. You might not agree with the high level politics, but you can agree that there is a pothole on the street and someone needs to fix it. You can agree that, you know, the local high school really should win state, right? And these are things that, you know, these are sort of like the first things to go as a business model for commercial news media has crumbled. And so when we were thinking about capital B, we really wanted to make sure that we were honoring the legacy of Black newspapers while also really filling the holes that the decline of local news has wrought. And also, what else is happening right now is the proliferation of social media as a venue for free news, right? And a lot of that stuff, that news, is not founded, it's not real, it's not contextualized, but it's free and it's everywhere. And so in order for us to go into a community and say, like, we're the news source, we have to have that deep engagement with the community so that they start to trust us and believe us and look to us for the information when it's really, really easy to turn on cable news or to go to TikTok and say, well, that guy on TikTok said that, so that's just real. And so, you know, a lot of the ways that we formulated capital B was to sort of address what we've lost, but also, you know, address the current challenges in reaching people with trustworthy information.
Jin.
For Initium, when Initium was founded in 2015, we were founded in Hong Kong. And at the time, there was no publication that actually speaks, kind of, I would say, native tone about Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China. And if you think about three places, those three places have completely different political infrastructure, different kind of education systems. People didn't really understand each other in day-to-day relevance. So Initium was founded on the idea that we can use journalism, help you to understand each other, help you understand different part of the society, and also help people to see each other kind of through journalism in a chronological way. That is not only about watching a film or watching a TV show. And I would say this still remains true these days as we think about the global diaspora Chinese audience. Chinese, even just talk about Chinese in America, we are one of the largest immigrant groups. But at the same time, majority of the Chinese who moved here, even if they speak English, even if they are, they received PhD degrees from, Ivy Leagues, many of them still wanted to read certain kind of news or information in Chinese. Why? Because it's very limited information that you can get through English to understand a context that is in your native language. At the same time, Chinese government have been doing a great job of borrowing more and more foreign journalists to access China, foreign scholars to access China. Being able to actually share those native views as well as talk about China not only through American lens is very important for the communities we serve. And in this, that also inspired me to going into this field, coming back from English newsroom to Chinese journalism. And that part I still see missing because the nuances that we were able to report out, we were able to access, when we are looking at a foreign correspondent model these days, still, in majority of the English newsrooms, if they ever still care about international journalism, to be honest, many of them don't. And they report on China in a way that everything is about American-centric. And, if we every single day only talk about, this past couple of weeks, the tariffs on China, you miss out so much about the depth and the real people's life in the country. At the same time, it doesn't really help any of us to understand each other. And it doesn't help us to move this, the problems or solutions forward. That I see still these days, American newsrooms or international newsrooms lack of when they think about China coverage or when they think about how they serve the immigrant communities that are actually able to speak English a lot and could be their readers, could be their audience in America.
Tristan.
The question was the future, what we're filling, what the future can look like.
Right.
I mean, I think similarly to what everyone else here said. I mean, Grist is focused on climate and the environment, but specifically, I run our Indigenous Affairs desk. So my focus and my team's focus is really doing stories about Indigenous communities, how climate change impacts Indigenous communities. But specifically, we do our work for Indigenous readers. So I think this is our primary audience whenever we're thinking about the stories that we're doing. You mentioned earlier about the crisis that started basically in the 2006, 2008, changing the news industry. For Indigenous media and tribal outlets, I would argue on some level that crisis didn't hit any of those outlets because they were already so severely underfunded and neglected by any of their mainstream colleagues or any sources of income that could actually support those hyper-local tribal outlets. We're still in the same sort of situation on some level that we were in 2008, as we were at the end of the 90s, as we were in the 1800s. When it comes to our media, we have a very deep and rich history of Indigenous journalism. So I think on my end, what I'm always thinking about, again, is how do I serve that audience? How do I find the stories that are going to resonate with that audience? And most importantly, how am I going to find stories that are going to inform that audience? So it's always that very delicate balance of trying to sort of like explain indigenous people to non-native people, which is not which is an important job, but it's not the job that I want, and it's not the job that I think my team wants either. You know, we are trying to fill a particular space that other outlets definitely will not fill. So I appreciate hearing what everybody here has said in terms of sort of moving toward more community-based and community-focused reporting. And I do think that is one of the futures that all of us are talking about here. And I think that even mainstream outlets and larger outlets would benefit a lot from sort of thinking about as well too. Is much more sort of focus on you know, local reporting. We have, you know, the hottest item right now is going after trying to track down government workers, find out how the Trump administration has impacted them. You know, if we'd been doing this with indigenous readers, black readers, any other readers for the last 20 to 30 years, I would argue that the industry may not be in the same situation it is now if we put in any of the same amount of effort to attract audiences and attract readers in the same way that we sort of bend over backwards nowadays for sort of middle-class white readers for the most part, right? So I think these are the lessons that I see and I hear here as well, is that it's local and international at the same time, and it's thinking potentially a little bit less U.S.-centric.
Well, I want to maybe drill a little bit more deeply into this particular theme that all three of you have touched on. How do we understand what it is that local communities need from the media that serve them? Actually, maybe to go back, what does it mean for media to serve a community as opposed to simply speak and be supported by a community because it's what's done? How do we do that? And so, Lauren, you and I talked not long ago. You were sharing with me a little sneak peek of your strategic plan in the coming years, and you used this term that I had never heard before, a community editor. And I remember saying, can we wind back that slideshow and can you tell me more about what a community editor is? That's one way, that's the way that Capital B does this. But so maybe I'll start with Lauren and just say, can you tell us more about that community editor role? Where did that come from? How do you conceive of that? What do they do? Maybe you can give us an example of it, and then I'd love to hear from Tristan and Jin, you know, how you do that same work of connecting to community.
So we have local newsrooms in Atlanta and in Gary, Indiana, and in both of those newsrooms we have a community engagement editor. The community engagement editor has a different sort of role than the other journalists in the newsroom. I will say that community engagement should just part and parcel of any local journalist's job, is like being out there, engaging, understanding. But you know what Capital B really wants to do is to sort of change the framework of how local journalism, or just journalism period, about communities is often practiced, which is in a sort of extractive way. Research surveys show that Black people have never, most Black people have never met a journalist in the wild. A lot of the people who we talk to in our communities say that the only time they see cameras or reporters in their neighborhood, or they read or see stories about their community, is when something bad has happened. And that feels incredibly untrue to the lives that they lead every day, obviously, but also it feels very extractive. When you don't care about us and the only time you're like searching for a quote is because someone got shot. And that isn't the practice of journalism that we want to have in the communities that we cover. I think there's often a misunderstanding when we say we want to be responsive to the community's needs, because I think it could come across as we're only giving people what they want to hear, which is absolutely not true and not journalism. What we're doing is trying to deeply understand the things that they don't understand, the stories that mainstream media got wrong, the stories that mainstream media never covered, the things that they've been begging for action on and have never gotten a response. And, looking into those things, talking to them, hearing about their day-to-day lives, telling stories about, not ignoring the challenges the communities have, but also telling stories about triumphs that the community has. And this sounds a bit like a huge indictment. I mean, it is an indictment of mainstream media, but also mainstream media is struggling, and they don't have that many journalists to do this kind of deep work in communities, which is why we find our community engagement editors so important. Their jobs are not to be out doing stories. Their jobs are only to be out talking to people. We run focus groups. We do community events. We do community walks with people. We, our community engagement editors have like open like office hours and coffee shops where it's like, come talk to me, come tell me about what's going on. And then they take what they are hearing and bring it back to the journalists in the newsroom. And, sometimes it's not a story, but it's just a deeper understanding that can help inform the day-to-day work. Sometimes it's a story. Sometimes a story that we do gets discussed amongst the community, and then we understand more about what's next, or how the civic engagement that we could create around this thing. And really, we want journalism and the practice of journalism and the gathering of information to feel like something that is shared within the community, and not just something that like journalists are doing. And these people who are experiencing these things have nothing to do with any of it. And because that's just not true. And it also doesn't feel very trustworthy to people in communities who've been ignored.
And you told me a story about a laundromat, as I recall, that doing laundry turned into a pretty significant story for Capital B.
Yeah, in Atlanta, one of our reporters was in a laundromat, and a woman came up to him or I don't know, he probably went up to her. That's probably how it happened. Started talking to her, but she ended up telling him that, you really need to come to my apartment complex because it's horrible. We're living under horrible conditions. No one will do anything. No one will listen to us. Our reporter went. It was kind of unimaginable the way tenants were living in this building, hole in the floor in the kitchen that you could see down into the apartment beneath. And so we wrote a story. We actually took video, posted a TikTok that a lot of people saw, and after we did that, and we've done a long series of stories on this, but after we did that, HUD got involved. HUD told us that, they would not have gotten involved if they had not read our story. We did our community engagement editor engineered a series of tenant events where we connected the tenants with the local officials to talk through what was going on. The end result is a lot of people got moved out into better housing, and a local organization got an enormous grant to pay some of these tenants to become housing advocates, which is huge. It has kind of nothing to do with us, but it does. It's like, the ripple effects of doing a story that everyone else ignored. And we recently got back in touch with one of the people that we initially talked to that I think we had lost touch with, and she told our reporter that she is living in a totally new and different community. She looks out her window and she sees grass. It's changed her life. It's changed the life of her kids. Her kids are running track and successful, and just, pointing back to, nobody cared. Nobody was going to do this story. There weren't enough journalists in the community to do this story. And, it shows the importance of just being out there and talking to folks and listening to them.
Thanks for sharing that story. Jin, how does Initium do this? Because you're in this very complex situation, right, where you're addressing a diasporic community, but you're in part reporting on things that are happening far away from that community. And in a country where that's not always easy to do. It turns out this country is also becoming such a country, I think, but which we'll come back to. But how do you understand your community and what it is that they want and need to know?
You know, the bar is so low sometimes, you just at least try a little bit, you'll do a good job. That's what I learned. I mean, for example, we do US election reporting like everyone else, everyone does it. And for us, the audience separates to people who live in the US who are Chinese and readers, and also people who are, don't know much about like details of US election, but they are watching from afar, looking at this as a global event. And last year, one story stuck with me a lot. We actually had a reporter following Chinese aunties canvassing in central Pennsylvania, going through Amish counties and canvassing for Republicans. And to be honest, I've been living in the US for over 15 years. I have never heard about a story like that. So that opened a lot my eyes even. And I would say, I'm pretty much, I live near DC, so I read a lot of politics reporting. Realizing that so many part of our community has never been reported on, and has never had someone going there to try to build that relationship, to actually figure out who wants to speak to a reporter, and to even just follow them for a few days to get that done is quite rare. And it's wild because it's central Pennsylvania. I feel like that area have more journalists than people at some point a week before election. But that actually happened. So and we see that repeatedly showing, no matter the work we do inside of China or in the global event settings. And in China, it's nowadays I have to say, just you have to go there to talk to real people, right? So many foreign correspondents these days don't have access actually in China. Many of them actually live in Taiwan because they can only do this reporting on China from afar. Very similarly to us, but the good part of this is that people I've worked with are actual Chinese, that we have family members, we have friends, we have people we grew up with, who later would tell us what they think, who will become our eyes and ears on the ground. At the same time, we also have people who are willing to work with us under tremendous risks these days. And we'll talk about this probably later about how that infrastructure looked like inside of China for journalism. But I would generally just say the space Initium occupied has a really low bar. Try to do something, talk to real people, try to understand them. And actually people are very willing to talk. Even in an environment that people, US and China are so hostile against each other, especially during the pandemic, I feel there are still a lot of space for this kind of work.
So Tristan, Grist covers indigenous communities and climate change globally. That's a big spread of communities. How do you first of all, how do you cover that? But at all? But how in particular do you stay connected as Grist, I mean, as the Indigenous Affairs Desk, with those communities to understand what they need?
Yeah, I mean, we're a small staff. My team is essentially 4 people, so we can't cover the entire world as much as we want to, and we try to. We kind of have to pick areas that we can kind of handle and that we can, build a beat around to some degree. But one way that we've gone about doing this is through collaborations and partnerships. So. For instance, we've launched recently something called the Indigenous News Alliance, where we're pulling together sort of a consortium of different indigenous news outlets from the U.S., Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, so that we can share our reporting amongst each other and work toward doing larger collaborations cross-border. This is really allowing us to sort of see what the topics are that other outlets are working on, what we should be thinking about, who they're talking to, and vice versa. It gives us a lot of opportunity to really learn about each other and be in community and conversation with each other, and build out essentially a fully indigenous network of reporters and content. So that's one way in which we at least do that work, is thinking that we have to be in community, we have to be in collaboration. I think this is one of the things about indigenous media that I think is very different than a lot of mainstream media, is that we are deeply, deeply collaborative. I think through almost my entire career working with any indigenous media outlets, collaboration has always been something that's on the table with other outlets. And I think that's incredibly unique. And unique that we can start scaling this up at an international scale. At least to stay in community, though, I mean, this is one of the reasons why we're always thinking about who we're hiring, who we're working with. One of the reasons I tell my reporters, you have to have a life. You can't work 7 days a week. There's a lot of reporters that would love to do, or maybe not love, but feel the need to do that. And it is really important that if you're going to do good work in your community, you have to be able to know who's out there. You need to spend time with it. This is one of the reasons that we also think a lot about hiring indigenous reporters. We really think about it. There's always been, I think, a misunderstanding about why there's such a high bar in terms of hiring when it comes to folks that are enrolled with their tribal members, enrolled tribal citizens, etc. The reason for this is that people come from communities and backgrounds in which they understand really complex federal systems. Like, the reason that we do really good work as indigenous reporters is that we've had to sit in an Indian Health Service waiting room. We've had to deal with, police on reservations or in our communities or whatnot. So that gives us a very different perspective and a very different background in terms of being able to go about our work. It's not something that we need to just we have to go out and learn. I mean, we kind of live it, right? So this makes a huge, huge difference. And I think, but also similar to what Jin said here, the bar is so low that we can get away with all kinds of stuff. And it seems sometimes it's the most simple stories. Sometimes, outlets are like, man, that's just amazing stuff. You think we just re-sliced bread. Well, yeah, but we just asked, it's just, So I think these are some of the things that we're always thinking about, is that we need people who are connected, to their families, to their communities, to their tribes, et cetera. That they can do this kind of work and are thinking, to the cliche, thinking globally and acting locally. Is something that we're always thinking about in terms of our work and being able to sort of move in those directions.
So I'm gonna stay with you, Tristan, for a minute. You modestly say the bar is low, and okay, I hear what you're saying, but you've also set the bar, I think, with some of your work, and I want to talk a little bit about the Land Grab Universities project, which you and Robert Lee worked on for High Country News. That was actually where I first became acquainted with your work, and I remember during the pandemic being listening to you on a webinar telling us about that, telling a national audience about that project. What I think is really special about that project is not just the enormous amount of data and research that you managed to pull off and put into an understandable form. And folks, this is still available, and please do check it out, because it's amazing. And now Tristan and his team have also created a kind of sequel, maybe. Sadly, a sequel was needed, called Misplaced Trust, which has been produced by Grist and is also available on Grist's website. But that project, the High Country News project, I think, seemed to me almost to kind of inspire, I don't know if we can call it a national movement, but there was action that it gave rise to across the country. We saw local news entities picking up that data and running with it. We saw student organizations, community organizations that were taking your findings, digging deeper, demanding action from local leaders and institutions. So maybe first, if you can just tell us all a little bit more about both of those projects, and then maybe tell us a little bit about the impact as you have experienced it.
Sure. So the original project, Land Grab Universities, looked at how land grant institutions were founded. So for folks, just quick cliff notes on this, anything sort of with like state in the title is likely a land grant. Land grant university. So Ohio State or whatever. Texas A&M. These are major sort of state colleges that are in this land grant university system. So essentially what we were doing in our reporting was trying to figure out what the land in land grant actually meant. Essentially what we found in our investigation was that the original 52 land grant institutions founded by Abraham Lincoln were more or less capitalized with indigenous land. So we were talking about something like 10.4 million acres of land that the federal government took from tribes and then gave to institutions in order to fund them. Most of these institutions would not have gotten off the ground without this land. So our project was to find that land, map it, find every single parcel, find every dollar that was paid for it, all the receipts, et cetera. So yeah, it was a pretty massive project. It took us about 2 years to pull together. And quite proud of it. I've written hundreds of stories in my career, but this is my hit, which is always exciting. That really helped sort of build this sort of theoretical framework that we can work with a lot more now. So when you're told that a land grant institution is founded with like indigenous land, it kind of makes sense, right? Like you're like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. Like America was built on stolen indigenous land. Like conceptually, sort of like you kind of understand it, but to be able to sort of have the receipts to show it was this piece for this much from this tribe that went to this university, and here's the bank account that it's still in. This is a very different story, right? So it helps us build this like theoretical framework. And our series that's still running right now, Misplaced Trust, sort of updates that and brings it into much more sort of current era with looking at different land acts that state schools used to fund and continue funding their institutions, also built on stolen indigenous land. Right now, those are called state trust lands. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe not. They're about as dull as they sound, but they are obviously fantastic to look into here. They're used for oil and gas extraction. They're used for timber, agriculture, et cetera. Those generate money for institutions like universities. But we also found that they generate most of the, or a large amount of funding for state prisons. They supply funding for some state hospitals. And the lion's share goes to K through 12 schools. So K through 12 schools are this is what these trust lands were mostly originally set aside for. And again, in states like Arizona or Texas, these are oil and gas lands for the most part. So, so this is kind of what we're playing with right now to sort of understand how institutions are using indigenous lands and extracting resources from them that are obviously detrimental to climate in order to fund their students now, and the question of what that future will look like after you sort of pillaged all of those resources and burnt all that fossil fuel. What sort of future are we sort of building when we're thinking about these lands in these terms? So these are kind of the projects that we've been looking at, and these are all sort of, again, built on that sort of like framework of like, where does that land come from? Whose was it before, and how did they get it? Is really, to some degree, an examination of sort of the America's like real estate system, and beyond that, really sort of what the United States and what these institutions actually owe to indigenous people, for the use of the land and for the use of those resources as well too. And a lot of that impact has been with institutions taking deep dives into their finances. In some cases, there's been free tuition for Native students at a few schools. We understand that's still an ongoing conversation, even with this administration. But yeah, that's kind of the nutshell of what we're working at. So it's kind of you to say set the bar. It could also be a warning too, whichever way you want to look at it. So.
It is a terrific project, and I urge everyone to take a look at both projects. But Lauren and Jin, I don't know if there are projects you would want to point to, either at Capital B or Initium, that you feel have really kind of sparked. Well, you've given us an example of one, Lauren, but are there any other projects you want to talk about that have really sparked action and inspired a kind of real change at a grassroots level?
It's really hard for me to say because, it's really hard to change things in China. But I will say a few years ago, if you look at the white paper movement, which ended China's COVID policy, Initium have done a lot of really amazing work on it. It was before I became the CEO, but I would also say, we became one of the last archives for that period of time of activism inside of China, because a majority of the internet fingerprints or footprints, you say in Chinese, are actually being taken down by the government after that short window of activism. And I believe until today, a lot of activists who were part of that movement became in exile and still live abroad. I mean, it's important. For me, I think the most important thing is to actually document whatever is happening in Chinese, in the native language we speak, and also making sure that it lives on the free internet, and making sure that the photos people took, risking their life to take, still be able to live somewhere, and we become that kind of archive for that history. We don't know what's the future, so better someone is taking notes and writing it down. And I would also say that movement actually inspired a lot of more people to understand, democracy, to understand what at that moment what people wanted. The voices being recorded are still relevant to today. Even though circumstances, things have changed, we're no longer in a COVID lockdown situation for years. People might be feeling differently in terms of how much anger they have, how much they are inspired to actually get on the streets and risk their life. But then we also documented the economic downturn of China pretty extensively in the past few years at the grassroots level, of trying to share stories about how people are losing their houses and how people are struggling with their job, government job, because they're not getting paid and all of that. I mean, someone gotta write that down and making sure that exists. I think that's. I don't hold Chinese journalism the same standard as I hold American journalism, I would say, because we're in a much fragile system. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize, as sometimes we always say we're writing the first draft of history. What if this is the only draft, And as I think about that, I feel like that's the most important part of our job.
Mm-hmm. I think about journalistic impact in a few different ways. I think the story that I told about the apartment complex is I think a classic sense of journalistic impact. You do a story, as a result, there's, tangible change in someone's life. Their circumstances tangibly changed because you shed light on something wrong that was happening. And that is a type of story that we seek to do. I think we try to have impact in a variety of different ways, though, because something that we really prize as impactful is doing work that helps people's day-to-day, helps people sort of understand things they didn't understand before. And then that then helps them to make decisions about how to lead their daily lives. Whether that is, how to access the stimulus check, or even are you eligible for it, or, how to enroll your kid in school, or how to navigate your community. This is sort of like what the government's job is supposed to be, but the government doesn't do this. And then, it's always sort of like where journalism stepped in, but there's less journalism doing that now. And so like if someone reads a capital B story and they're like, now I understand how to get this thing I need, that is impact. It is also impact that's like so much easier to attain than an investigation, which is important but takes a really long time, and maybe you do the whole investigation and nothing happens. and you have to bank on, you have to say that that's worth it, right? But if you do a story that's sort of answering community questions, that's going to help people immediately to potentially change their lives or their kids' lives. Our reader surveys say that 25% of our audience has said that reading a story on capital B has prompted them to take civic action, to vote in a local election, to volunteer in their community. And that is amazing, meaningful impact that we're so proud of every day.
Well, that's a super note for me to end my questions on. I had a really tough question and depressing question that I was going to end, but Brett tells me that we actually do want to, he reminds me that we do want to have questions from all of you. So if you have questions, we have a mic, and no one has questions? Perfect. I can ask my really depressing question. No, here's one right here.
Thanks so much. It's really been a great panel. This might be a depressing question, but I'm wondering, what's the financial model for your work? Is it funded by subscriptions or philanthropy? And maybe I would be interested to hear you talk a little bit more about that, given how challenging the journalism world seems to be in terms of revenue that is sustainable. So thank you.
Who wants to start?
I'll take it. We're a nonprofit, so our revenue is primarily, philanthropic, from foundations, like Luce, who's a wonderful supporter of ours, to individual donors, to small dollar donors who aren't really getting anything in return, but like read a piece, it meant something to them. They donated or became monthly donors. We do have a earned revenue side, earned revenues ads, basically, but it is supplemental to the philanthropic revenue that we get, not our whole business model.
Initium is a subscription-based company. We're private. For various reasons, never become a nonprofit, because that means we need to basically open the book, and governments will be able to see who is on staff and who is on our board and all of that. It's not really realistic. But however, because we are a subscription-based organization, one key thing when I was as CEO, what I did was trying to do this giant project on product revamp, basically making sure that we are a digital first, not only a digital native organization, but also actually having infrastructures that help people to navigate, and also making sure they do get serviced through this technology. And I think a lot of times these days, news media, especially, I've always worked at small nonprofits in the US or medium-sized nonprofits in the US. Many of us don't have that kind of resource to do the product work that is necessary to build an organization that is already fully online, but doesn't have that kind of online infrastructure to like I would say similar like a New York Times that will actually prompt the right information in front of you when you need it, and at the same time, having the right place of a paywall, and having all those, run all those A/B testing, and making sure we convert people correctly. It's very difficult. It really takes a lot of resource and time, energy, right people, talent to actually do that kind of work. Chinese field is especially difficult, especially in the free market, because we don't have that kind of infrastructure to grow that kind of people. I hired audience producers in my role, and I don't have a Chinese translation for audience producer. That's how lack of product and audience knowledge that is in that language entirely. So I have to write a job description in Chinese and then put the job title audience producer. And my Taiwanese audience producer got hired, told me, it's really hard for me to try to explain my job to anybody. And I was like, no kidding. I actually have asked all the friends in journalism industry, no matter in English or Chinese, and I have asked a lot of professors in colleges who teaches journalism. I was like, how would you translate audience producer? They don't know. So that just speaks to how difficult these days for news media to survive, especially when you're in a field that doesn't really have that kind of strong pipeline. Yeah.
I mean, similar to Capital B, Grist has a very similar structure as a nonprofit. In terms of what that financial model in the future looks like, I don't know. It's not my area of expertise, but I think what I do know is that if we're not thinking about how we're reaching audiences in the future, I think that is really the key here. And I sort of mentioned it at the beginning is that any news outlet, for the work, needs to be thinking about how they're going to be serving more communities directly. So Spanish speaking, indigenous, Muslim, I mean, whatever the sort of area that you're really wanting to sort of to report in, you can gain the trust of those communities, you can do good work in them, and I think in the long run you'll find the support there that your outlet is looking for. But the one thing that concerns me is that I don't see a lot of outlets actually doing this, is that you need to start building that trust and that pipeline now. Because you're probably not talking to 4 or 5 years until we start seeing returns on that. But if reporters and news outlets are not doing that, we are absolutely guaranteed to fail in the future. There's no question about it. Yeah, my depressing response here was that because I don't see that happening, I'm deeply worried about the future of journalism. And unfortunately, the call is sort of coming from the basement. It's not just the administration.
Other questions? We have one here and then one up here.
So we just talked about finances, but I'm also curious what you think about ownership models. One thread of conversation that's come up about the future of journalism is worker co-ops. We have Defector, which covers mostly sports, other things. We have Aftermath covering games, 404 covering the internet, Hellgate covering New York City. How much do you think the ownership structures of journalism need to change, and the decision making, does it need to adapt to the situations that we've been discussing so far?
Yes, every bit of it has to change. I mean, we need to start talking about CEO salaries at institutions. We need to start talking about co-ownership models. We need to start thinking about how budgets are being used a lot more. I mean, I used to work at Al Jazeera America, and I remember when it came out about how much they were spending on flowers, fresh flowers every day, was enough more or less to sort of pay my rent for the month. And it was like, oh my God, things like this that you really need to think about. But again, all of those, if we're really truly thinking about the survival of journalism, we have to think about changing almost every single bit of it. I look at NPR, for instance. I mean, the hosts on NPR are what, $500,000 pay rates, right? They're good, but I don't know anybody who's $500,000 good at anything. I literally don't. And if it's a matter of do you get 4 more local reporters and maybe somebody who's $250,000 good kind of a thing, then we really need to have those conversations, right? When you have to listen to Pledge Drive and Fund Drive just like anybody else. A lot of that is going to massive CEO pay. We really have to start talking about it if we want to survive. But again, these are harder conversations for the industry to have if we're looking at a just future, not only for our readers but for our reporters as well too.
I think fundamentally, news organizations, how they build talent, how they, infrastructure their own teams, is going to change so much as glad we have not talked anything about AI. But think about how that's going to interrupt how every one of you consume journalism or consume information. And at the same time, how what is the place of journalism in the future, and also how we actually produce it, what kind of information we produce, and in what format, and what kind of data we actually put in those LLMs, right? And that is like going to change the entire team's infrastructure. It's not going to look like what we have right now. And does that going to change ownership? I hope so, because right now this model doesn't work. So I hope down the road we figure something out. I'm less grim about the future of journalism because I actually truly see there are more and more people consuming information these days, because internet is widely more accessible in different part of the world, if you not only think about America. But at the same time, like I think the infrastructure we currently build does not support that kind of consumption into facts and truth and in-depth knowledge. But that doesn't mean down the road we don't have opportunities to completely flip everything upside down. And that for me is scary and interesting, because I believe there are still a lot of opportunities in this business that could achieve what we want to do. And right now we couldn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of them. I think that disruption is necessary. I think when you look at the biggest newspapers in the country, and that they are either, being, sold for parts, or have billionaire owners who are meddling in editorial. I think that is a sign that we need a lot of different types of news sources, because the ones that, have been held up to the highest standards are challenged, And so I'm fascinated by the defector model. I think, selfishly, like I think the nonprofit news boom is, I think, really, really promising across the country. And we just need to find ways to fill the holes with more independent news. And I also, I've been a journalist for a long time. And when I first started in journalism, there was just this idea that like the business didn't have anything to do with us as like reporters, or it's somehow compromising to understand how the business works, and that's shifted completely, and needs to shift even more, because in order for journalism to survive, everyone kind of has to have a stake in how that survival happens.
I think we have time for one more question, and I think you had a question here in the black. Yeah.
Thank you all for your service, all four of you. I want to recount a quick thing. There's a guy named Bruce Oster at NPR who last week presented to a small group of us about regional news, and they're spending not $500,000 on people's salaries. They're spending very little to do extraordinary work. And he said something that I just want to share, which was, in a democracy, people need to be informed. And if people have been so siloed, and I'll try to ask it and talk about it in a way to include China, but when we're all on opposite sides and no one's listening, the only way to welcome people back, and he was talking a lot about a young audience, is to actually be reporting from their community. So if you want to talk about criminal justice reform, you interview the warden, who's a buddy. So even if these people are turning on Fox News and driving in their car, listening to Fox News, and don't trust national media, even though he says, don't they know that is national media? The local is the way in. And I'd never thought about that, and you're actually each talking about making sure that local voices are heard, and that might be the way back, because I don't know about everybody else, but free press is the fourth arm of government, and if we don't have it, which we don't right now, we're doomed. So thank you each. I think my question after that little bit is, A, how do we engage younger people to understand that clueless is not an option? And how do we make sure that we all, maybe specifically how we each as individuals make sure we're doing our part to make sure that free and fair press continues to thrive?
I mean, I'll take the young part because every news organization is desperately thinking about this all the time, right? And that I think that we, as a very broad industry, have tended to be far, far too precious about this profession and about who gets to do it and who doesn't get to do it and who gets to be called a journalist and who doesn't. And I think movement has been made on that, I think that's something that's pretty essential to reaching young people is really embracing some of the, even if we don't agree with them all the time or we don't agree with their practices all the time, really embracing some of the current ways that they get news and the people they're getting it from, and working with them on maybe doing stories together, or maybe a lot of TikTokers, they're getting famous off of being sort of like breaking news reporters, but a lot of them are just like reading the New York Times as breaking news and not really saying it's from the New York Times. And so, what if like news organizations are actually like engaging with them actually, and we make more journalists. We engage them in the process of journalism and understanding how quality news is collected and how to fact check your own stuff and how to do all of these things. I think I think part of it is there's a pretty deep snobbery and elitism within the practice of journalism that really, really needs to change. I know you had a two-part question, but I don't want to hog.
Oh, I agree with completely with what you said. I also will say, young people taught me a lot of things. I mean, hard to say I'm not young anymore, but like, I definitely believe that we need to be where they are at. Like, just publishing our own platforms does not really, get the words out. And at the end of the day, we're delivering information. So in whichever way that they receive information, I'm willing to try it. And also, I hope that more and more, and I know for a fact that even these days, journalism industry is kind of grim. We're still seeing record number of applicants for a lot of, high school programs, fellowship programs we run at, college level. So they wanted to enter this business, and they know how to engage with their peers, and we should embrace that. We don't have a choice, so we have to do it. And for each of you to, support that kind of work, support democracy, I think as more and more nonprofit newsrooms pop up in this country, more and more people should know that they need to pay for journalism. And it is not okay to pay a $500,000 salary for an anchor, but it's also not okay to pay $30,000 for a reporter. Like, we need to actually be able to sustain this profession if we are serious about supporting this kind of work. If you enjoy journalism, you enjoy reading it, you enjoy listening to it, you need to know that every single minute you spend on journalism, there is a team of reporters and editors who have spent hundreds of hours to do that in 1 minute for you. And that's, and many of them have to go through very expensive education to get here as well. So I hope everyone understands the expense of it, because we're not counting on only foundations to support this kind of work. Everyone needs to understand that you have to pay. And when people are not informed, you're in a very bad situation.
Yeah.
I speak from true life experience from China.
I would piggyback off that and to say that, there are some people who truly can't pay, right? And I think that news is a public good and a public service, and capital B is free, for that reason. We're not paywalled, but at the same time, it is definitely not free to do. And so the people who can pay, people who can support, are supporting not just the work, but they're supporting the ability of people who can't pay to get that work. And I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree with all of that as well too. I mean, I think the amount of work that goes into it is absolutely massive. The amount of money that it takes is massive, and I tend to think of journalism as a fundamental human right. It's the right to information and access to information, right? I am fundamentally against paywalls. I understand their purpose. Don't get me wrong, I get it. But if we truly believe that journalism is a public service, and I would argue a fundamental human right, then we have to make it accessible. And I think, yeah, asking for help and for support. So read the stories, share the stories, donate them if you can. And as for youth, I mean, I think I agree with everybody in terms of working with folks, but I would also say as my misspent youth myself was very clueless. So I'm sometimes not sure how to. It depends on the youth age, I suppose. But yeah, being a youth myself at one point, knowing how clueless I was, I'm not sure. Oh no, you said an option to be clueless, kind of a thing. I think that's everybody's sort of like fundamental political development. But this also speaks to, again, sort of reporting in schools, education. I mean, when we're thinking about pipelines into journalism, there's so many different options that have not even been tried. That would really provide that sort of underpinning to understand the importance of what a reporter does, even from like high school age on, right? Like these are things that can happen, and help everybody in terms of like media literacy and bringing more people into the industry. But again, we're talking larger sort of fundamental changes, and since I think most of our industry right now is sort of in a defensive crouch on some level, it's sort of never been the time to talk about pipelines into the industry. It's never been the right time to talk about DEIJ. It's never been the right time to talk about anything that changes the status quo in the industry. But again, there's always a time to do it. Now's as good a time as any. We missed the opportunity during COVID. We missed the opportunity during the recession in 2008. We keep missing these opportunities here. And I think that sounds like I'm being depressing about it, but I am very hopeful that at some point somebody is going to start making those decisions more widely that are good for everybody.
Well, Tristan Ahtone, Lauren Williams, and Jin Ding, thank you so much for taking the time and for such a terrific conversation. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And thanks to MacDowell and the MacDowell team and also the Luce team that made this possible. And thanks so much for being here, all of you and everyone online. Good night.